Bismillah Rahman Rahim. This is Salim Akhtar Malik, your host at the Observation Post channel. On this channel, I discuss issues of national and international importance, security and defense matters, as well as important events from military history. You can interact with me on my channel by giving your views and comments, and you can also connect with me on Twitter, where my address is at Salim Akhtar 53. In this session, I'll be talking to you about the recent fighting between the Israelis and Palestinians, which resulted in the burning of Al Aqsa Mosque, the Israeli firing inside the mosque and in its surroundings, as well as a state of war between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So when I say Palestinian between a war between the Palestinians and the Israelis, I differentiate it from the previous wars between the Arabs and the Israelis. This time, Palestinians are fighting alone against the Israelis. And I use an expression that in desperation, the Palestinians have grabbed the Israeli sword by its blade. This has happened after almost 70 years as a result of the indifference of the Arab rulers. I don't blame the Arab rulers as much because they had their own axe to grind. When it comes to finding a solution to the Palestinian problem, and when it boils down to the things on the ground, it will be the Palestinians who will decide their own fate in context of their struggle against Israel. So it all started at Sheikh Jara, which is a village, which is an Arab village some distance away from Al Aqsa Mosque. So it lies in eastern Jerusalem. Some time back, the Israelis, following policy, their old policy of creeping into Arab territory, that is Palestinian territory, had declared that they would be building a new settlement in Sheikh Jara. That is a new Israeli settlement in Sheikh Jara. By the way, Sheikh Jara was the personal physician to Salahuddin Ayyubi, the legendary Salahuddin Ayyubi. And there is a mosque and a seminary in the village named after Sheikh Jara. So the Palestinians, they appealed to the Israeli Supreme Court. They pleaded to the Israeli Supreme Court to prevent the Israeli government from encroaching into their territory and from evicting them from their houses. But it was a given that the Israeli Supreme Court, like it had been doing in the past, would give its verdict in favor of the Israeli settlements. So there were clashes. First, when the Israelis, as their policy is, as they had been doing frequently in the past also, they tried to prevent the Palestinians from praying inside the mosque. And there were occurrences of firing in which many Palestinians were martyred. So, in support of what had in support of their Palestinian brethren who were martyred inside the mosque, the Palestinians from Sheikh Jara marched onto Al-Aqsa and demonstrated. The Israelis gave it a twist by saying that it was a issue of claims on real estate by private parties, whereas it was not. So the Sheikh Jara conflict expanded into a wholesome bloodshed in which the Palestinians, as had been happening in the past, suffered more casualties than the Israelis. So, as I said, this time Israel is going to wage, it has already unfolded a war against Palestinians, and this will blow up into a full fledged war. And this time it will be the Palestinians alone which will face the blunt of Israeli aggression. Their Arab neighbors have either concluded peace treaties with Israel or in the process of concluding peace treaties. Those who have not openly concluded peace treaties with Israel are in the process of concluding peace treaties and opening up their countries to Israeli commercial ventures and economic expansion. So it was easier for Israelis to defeat the conventional armies, the conventional Arab armies, in the wake of the 1967 and 73 wars. Because Israelis were waging war, or they were fighting war rather, inside the territories of their Arab neighbors. They had defeated the Arabs solely by air power during the 1967 war, but then that air power was used not within their own airspace but in the airspace of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. They fought against the Egyptian, Jordanian, and the Syrian armies during the 1967 war, not inside their own country, but by taking the war inside the Arab territories. And this had been the strategy of Israel, never to fight a war in its own territory and preempt the Arabs by starting the wars and carrying the war into Arab territories. This happened in 73 also. Israel was attacked by Egypt and Syria, but then the war was quickly carried inside the Egyptian and Syrian territories. This time, Israel will be fighting the Palestinians inside its own territory. Now they are so intermingled with each other that it will be very difficult to use the air power against Palestinians effectively, because then Israelis would be bombing their own people. Likewise, fighting the Israelis would not be like fighting the Palestinians by the Israelis would not be like in a conventional war fighting an enemy in the enemy territory or carrying the war into enemy territory. They would be fighting the Palestinians in their own territory. Now, their strategy seems to be to drive all the Palestinians living in the west bank of River Jordan into Gaza Strip. which is sort of a huge prison in which more than 1 million Palestinians have been forced, and they have been squeezed in an area which is not bigger than, rather, it is smaller than Karachi. There is no water, and the so called Palestinian Authority, which came into existence as a result of the war that American coalition waged against Saddam Hussein. So the treaty which was reached for the establishment of a so-called Palestinian Authority, that Palestinian Authority is a non-state. It does not have the powers of a state. It has no airspace and it has no sea boundaries. The Palestinians cannot carry out fishing inside their own territorial waters. So this is some sort of a prison which will be attached, into which the Israelis will try to force the Palestinians living in the Jordan Valley. They would squeeze them into that territory and thereafter try to bomb them into oblivion. This can be a possibility because the West, headed by the United States, is supporting them. But then the Arab rulers, that is the neighbors of Israel, had been exhorting their people to drown Israel into the sea. That was an empty slogan. What has happened is that instead of Israel getting drowned into the sea, Israel has drowned. It has almost thrown Palestinians into the sea. However, as I said, it will not be it will not be easy for the Israelis to fight a war, a full-fledged war inside their own territory, by embroiling themselves, by embroiling their armed forces, particularly their army, with the Palestinians, because there are no boundaries, there are no clearly defined boundaries separating the Israelis and the Palestinians inside the the post 1967 borders. So this is going to happen, and the nature of war has changed from a kinetic war to a non-kinetic war, in which more emphasis is laid on indirect means, psychological warfare, cyber war, and such a war is fought in a manner where the enemy is defeated even before the conventional war starts. This is going to happen in a future war between Palestinians and Israelis, which war, as I said, has already started unfolding. And this time, there are chances that Israel will have to succumb to Palestinian demands for their rights. And this time, Israel will not be saved by its allies in the West and in the United States. This is what I wanted to say in this session. See you in the next video with a new topic. Till then, bye bye.